Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Now, today it's being reported that the Ukrainians have been and continue to use roughly 5,000 to 7,000 rounds of heavy artillery per day against Russian forces, while the Russians are sending downrange in excess of 20,000 rounds per day. So just to give you an idea of how large and intense this conflict is, a smaller European nation state will usually produce or obtain roughly 5 to 7,000 155 millimeter and lower artillery rounds per year. So again, an incredible amount of ammunition is being expended by the Ukrainian military, as is Russian forces as well. The amount of ammunition that is being used by the Ukrainians exceeds the production capacity that Western nations are able to supply the Ukrainians. So if the Ukrainians continue at this current tempo of 5 to 7 rounds per day, again, at a certain point, unless production in the West is vastly increased, we are going to see a slowdown in the amount of rounds the Ukrainians are going to be able to fire against Russian forces. And we're already starting to see that. In certain sectors of the conflict, the Ukrainians simply don't have any more ammunition. Now, with that being said, we continue to see this very large buildup of Russian forces. We continue to see the Russians also making advances in the area near Siversk, northeast of Siversk, and due north of Siversk. And I've talked about this again in those previous episodes, where we think there is a opportunity for Russian forces to execute a possible large-scale maneuver operation late summer against this pocket that continues to form around Siversk. I mean, we continue to look at what is happening in Bakhmut, and obviously that continues. Now, the majority of the Russian forces that are engaged near Bakhmut are these Wagner forces, private military contractors. But to the north of Bakhmut, you have regular Russian military, and you have a multitude of Russian divisions. And we're going to use this deep state map today just to kind of see what Russian forces are building up in this area. And obviously before we looked at what the Ukrainians had near Siversk, and it's essentially a army corps, an army group of about 10 brigades in and around Siversk, if not more. The Russians, if we look at this in terms of, you have the 237th Airborne Assault Regiment. That's a component, that's an element of the 76th Airborne Division, Air Assault Division of the Russian VDV. The 230, again, that's an element of the 76th Division. So it looks like the entire 76th Russian Airborne Division is operating near Kreminna. Joining that force, you have the 55th Mountain Motorized Rifle Brigade. This is from Russia's east, that has been deployed to the area of operations. You have the 35th Separate Guards Motorized Rifle Brigade. The elements of the 90th Tank Division. Now, it would be a good question to ask is just how much of the 90th Tank Division is deployed near Crimea. And you have additional units as well. Elements of the 144th Motorized Rifle Division as well. We zoom out a little bit and go further to the north. You have the 4th Guards Tank Division. Now that's a component of the 1st Guards Tank Army. And again, these are elements. So 9th Motorized Rifle Regiment. It is an element of the 18th Motorized Rifle Division. 27th Separate Guards Motorized Rifle Brigade. Another element from an actual tank division, 26th Tank Regiment from the 47th Tank Division, 1st Guards Tank Army. 2nd Motorized Rifle Division from the 1st Guards Tank Army. That unit's normally based near Moscow and was used earlier in the conflict. So again, we're looking at elements or the entirety of anywhere from 4 upwards to maybe 6 Russian divisions, along with independent brigades as well, operating north of Bakhmut, northeast of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. So you have to ask yourself, if indeed all these units are deployed in this area, and this is by far the largest concentration of Russian forces in this area near Crimea and north of Crimea, what is next? What is this force getting ready to do? And I would say at this point, all signs lead to this Siversk pocket. And again, possibly forcing their way, it would be on the left Ukrainian flank to then envelop Ukrainian forces, probably moving in a south by southwesterly direction to get behind Siversk and then eventually meet up with Russian forces that are pushing out of Krasnohora in this area as well. So you can see those units, 123rd Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade, 4th Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade, 10th Artillery Brigade, 6th Separate Motorized Rifle of the LNR. But again, the force that's up here, ultimately we are going to see some maneuver operations come summer by Russian forces. And I anticipate that this is where we will see the main Russian effort to possibly look to defeat this fairly static Ukrainian force that's operating near Siversk, continuing to put up resistance in the Bakhmut pocket, and then obviously further to the south, you have an additional envelopment operation occurring near Avdiivka. And if you look at this again, a fairly large Russian force construct consisting of the 11th Separate Rifle Regiment, 9th Separate Regiment of Marines. This is a Novorossiya Battalion, 11th Separate Motorized Rifle Regiment, Vostok. That is a Chechen unit, I believe. Someone will definitely correct me if I'm wrong. 33 Guards Motorized Rifle Regiment, regular Russian military formation. Oops. So again, and then finally, the 60 Separate Motorized Rifle Battalion. And then larger units, 20 Motorized Rifle Division in Donetsk. And then the 1st Army Corps of the DPR. But most of these larger Russian regular military formations are massing in this area. I mean, we see other Russian units near and fighting along this line of contact, but Really, nothing is comparable to what we're seeing up here in the northeast quadrant of the conflict. Definitely, again, largest Russian forces massing in this area. If we go down here to Volhodar, where we have seen the back and forth engagements in these areas that look more like reconnaissance operations, force reconnaissance operations, 40th Naval Infantry Brigade, 14th Separate Special Purpose Brigade, 72nd Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade, and then finally the 155th Separate Brigade of Marines. So not a overly large force down in the south, but again, I believe at this point we may not see large-scale offensive operations in the south. The Ukrainians are going to have to move its forces to the north to try and blunt this very apparent Russian offensive operation that could be in the works come summer. So we've continued to hear about the possibility that the Ukrainians are looking to launch this massive operation designed to cut the land corridor to Crimea. But the Ukrainians are not going to be able to do that if the Russians are threatening the northern flank. And given the lack of Ukrainian air power, if the Ukrainians do move in the south, the Russians are going to be able to negate that with the use of its air force. And we've seen that happen. We've seen that occur. Obviously, the Russian Air Force is probably not performing to the capabilities and standards it had hoped at the beginning of the conflict, but nonetheless, the Russian Air Force is still operational. It is still going after Ukrainian targets on the ground, and we'll continue to see that occur, especially in the southern area where it is namely vast open farmland, plains, fields. So if you do have large maneuver elements of the Ukrainian military operating in this area in the south, the Russians are going to see that, and they're going to be able to attack those formations with both attack helicopters and aircraft. But the Ukrainians have to be concerned about what's going to happen in the north, and thus any of those offensive forces that the Ukrainians were going to utilize in the south, in all probability, are going to be redeployed to the north. Looks like the Ukrainians are still trying to hold on to Bakhmut, or trying to get their forces out of Bakhmut, one or the other, while at the same time they have to be watching what's happening up here in the north. And that's going to probably disallow that full-on reported offensive by the Ukrainian military in the south. Compounding that for the Ukrainians is the issue with ammunition and munitions. They're running out. They're outpacing the supply capacity of the West. And at a certain point, the Russians are just going to continue to hammer the Ukrainian front lines unobstructed by Ukrainian forces, which is just what's going to happen and is happening. And then compounding that, you also have to look at China. In all probability, the Chinese are going to start assisting the Russians with the production or the direct shipment of ammunition for Russian field guns. 152 millimeter, 130, 122 millimeter systems, if not providing directly support to Russia in terms of other systems as well. But this is where we are watching, again, very, very closely, again, northeast of Sloviansk. This pocket right here near Siversk, and then obviously this massive Russian buildup that is occurring to the north. And we're not hearing a lot about it on the mainstream media in terms of what the Russians could be preparing to do in the north. So we'll continue to watch this and report. Thank you for joining us today. More to come very, very soon. And as always, have a good day.